This episode is one of a series in which we investigate the manifold ways in which people in the Middle East have attempted to control and utilize water over the course of history. My name is Dr. Ed Hayes, and I work as part of a team of researchers on the project Source of Life, Water Management in the Premodern Middle East at Radboud University in the Netherlands. There is a famous poem by the 10th century poet Abu Ishaq as-Sabi, which compares the water supplies of the two great cities of medieval Iraq. And it goes as follows. Alas, I deeply miss Baghdad. I miss her snowy water. Here in ugly Basra, we are watered with only sickly yellowish drinks. How could we be satisfied drinking it, while on our own land we clean our behinds with purer water? Today, in the first episode of this series, we are going to start with a general overview of the complex systems that developed to provide water to the large and densely populated cities of the medieval Middle East. To discuss this, I am joined by Dr. Maaike van Berkel and Dr. Josephine van den Bent. Maaike van Berkel is a professor of history at Radboud University in Nijmegen, and Josephine van den Bent is an assistant professor in history at the University of Amsterdam. Maaike leads the Source of Life project, which investigates water management in the pre-modern Middle Eastern city. And Josephine and myself also work on this project, which provides the inspiration for this series of podcast episodes. Maaike and Josephine, a very warm welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just to orient ourselves to you and the project, how did you come to work on this subject, Maaike? What was your inspiration?
Well, for some time I have been working on central administration, on the Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate. And then actually through some colleagues at the University of Amsterdam, with whom I was working then, they were working on cities and urban administration, and I started to wonder more about urban governance, urban administration, so from the central to the more urban level. And then I run into the whole debate on the so-called Islamic cities, which is a debate on the organization of cities in the Middle East as compared to the organization of cities in medieval Europe, or late medieval Europe, early modern Europe. And it's an old debate actually, but still very prominent in many comparative studies. And people focus on the idea that the European medieval city came up and was well organized and self-supporting and self-supplying and having a lot of autonomous urban institutions, while cities in the Middle East were weakly organized, under-institutionalized. Well, there has been a lot of critique on this debate, but still, as I said before, it's very dominant in many situations in which cities in the Middle East and Europe are compared. So then I thought, well, how can we study urban organization? And I thought about many aspects of urban organization, many aspects of urban services, public services that need to be provided in cities which were enormous. They were large in the medieval Middle Eastern period. They were sometimes 500,000 inhabitants, sometimes 200,000 inhabitants, and you can't have a weak organization with so many inhabitants. So then I thought about water provision. If you are able to organize water, then you are able to organize your city life in a good way. So water became the lens to look at urban organization, to look at urban governance. So that's how I came to water management.
So it sounds like you're really challenging some misconceptions out there in the broader conception of the Middle Eastern city.
Yes, that's right. But these misconceptions, well, I'm not the first to challenge them. There are many people who said that this whole misconception on the Islamic city should be challenged. And although many people said that it can't be true, that you can't have these big cities, these enormous cities with the many inhabitants without clear forms of organizations, because otherwise it would have been a mess. It's still not very clear then how different and what are the type of organizations that cities had in the medieval Middle Eastern world. So, and that's where water came in. That's one way of looking at urban institutions. Yeah, so that's one misconception, still prominent, not I think about among regional specialists, but still prominent among non-regional specialists.
Absolutely. But so that leads us on to the question of how then you can address this. You say that still it's not entirely clear what forms of organizations exist. So what are the sources? Like how can we begin to answer these questions that you've set up?
Well, we start from the premises that there should be organizations, that there should be institutions. And then I think another way to approach is by not just looking at the formal top-down state organizations, but look at water management from a everyday practice. So also bottom up communities, individuals. So look at the broader picture on who is organizing the water for the city in a commercial way, in a public way, who is financing it. These are the kind of questions we look at. And also not in a static way, because also one of the misconceptions with this city and more general with an Orientalistic approach to the Middle East is that it's an essentialist approach, that it's static, not changing. So what we do is also look at the broader developments, and we look at water infrastructure and the management of the water infrastructure from approximately 700 till 1500 in various places. So have a comparative approach within the Middle East itself. That's one of the approaches we have. We have this diachronic approach. Another way of dealing with this is by looking at diverse sources. So mainly textual sources and material sources. And I think that's been very fruitful. So to combine archaeological approaches with historical approaches. That's been one of the most fruitful things within the project so far, I think.
So what can you give me a little more sense of what are the sources that we're looking at? What are the textual sources first? What kind of books exist that have something about water in them? Are there texts that are all about water management, or do you have to pick and choose little bits here and there?
We have to pick and choose because unfortunately we would love to have like texts only on water management, but we use chronicles, histories, we use legal texts, we use geographies, literature, prose and poetry. There's a lot of sources which say something. Well, poetry, such as the poem you started with this episode. So there is a lot of information, but it's really, you have to work yourself through a large number of texts to find bits and pieces on water management. So it's, and we have hardly any documents for the medieval Middle East. We do have the Waqf documents. We will get back to the Waqf religious endowments later on. And those are really fruitful as well, and they're part of our project sources. But it's there's a great number of sources, but it's really you have to work your way through a lot of texts. With archaeology, it's we have excavations, we have materials left, but the archaeologist within our project also works with aerial surveys, photography, satellite imagery, and that's mainly important, especially the photography of the early 20th century during the First World War, but also imagery from the 60s, which is relevant because it's before the huge urban developments in some of the places in the Middle East. And you can see in the landscape still part of the infrastructure, which, you don't know whether it's medieval, but still connecting it to textual sources, it gives great information also on the infrastructures, yes. And I think it's as I said, it's so fruitful to work with the material and textual sources because they give such a different kind of information. The textual sources tell us something about the management. The material sources hardly say something about the management, but more about the infrastructure. But the material sources give us a better glimpse of the everyday practice, so a broader social group than the textual sources, which are very much written from the elite perspective, from the court, the central perspective as well. So, yeah, texts also talk about specific moments in history, specific events, and that's also interesting because they talk about crisis, for example, but they don't generally talk about the normal situation, and archaeology does. So, yeah, this combination has been very fruitful for us.
So let's move on to get a sense of specifically what kinds of infrastructure we're talking about when we're thinking of these sort of large interlocking systems that provide water in cities. So just turning to Josephine, what are the main types of infrastructure that we're talking about?
To get water to people, you have to go through a number of steps, really, and all of those steps, have infrastructure of some sort. So there's, of course, the source of the water, which is often a river. There can be other sources, for instance, in an oasis, but that's not usually what we're looking at. So for our cities, this is really primarily rivers. So that's one. And then a river tends to go through the middle of the city. The city expands on one or both banks of that river, but then you're still quite far away from the river itself. So that means you often have canals that are dug to guide the water into different parts of the city. So I think canals are a really key bit of infrastructure in many of the cities that we look at. But there are also different other fairly major sets of infrastructure, and those can be for storage, for instance. So one can think of cisterns, of pools that we see in cities that can be quite massive constructions. And those cisterns also, for instance, show up on the pilgrimage roads from Iraq and Syria to Mecca and Medina. So storage of massive volumes of water, and that can be both water coming in from rivers, but also rainwater. That is also a key bit of infrastructure. And then there's other sort of more ways of transporting water. So aqueducts, for instance, either overground. So you could sort of imagine a little bit of what you might imagine Roman aqueducts to look like, but also underground canals, so underground aqueducts. So that's also something that we encounter. And then users actually have to get to water. So people might have their own, especially richer people might have a private cistern. But there's also infrastructure in the sense of people, so water carriers. So to a certain extent, people are also getting water from people going to the river or going to a cistern, taking out water, usually in leather bags. And bringing that to other users. So that is a type of infrastructure that is much harder to see on an archaeological level, although there have been the occasional finds of these leather vessels. That's also infrastructure. And then finally, of course, there is wastewater. That also exists. So one can think of latrines. But we also have source material that references, for instance, drain pipes. Coming into streets. So, for instance, HISPA manuals that say, like, oh, you must make sure that drain pipes aren't running water into the streets in narrow roads, because that will make roads impassable, will soil people's clothes. So those are all kinds of different forms of infrastructure that in one way or another have something to do with the water management, both of provision, but also sort of clearing it out once you're done with it, that are important for us to look at.
Could you just explain what a HISPA manual is for those who might not have heard this term?
Yes, of course. These HISPA manuals are written for people known as muhtasibs, and they're in charge of the markets. They're in charge of other elements of public order, of public decency. There is some kind of supervisor of the markets, of general public order, and there's been this tradition of manuals of instruction written for them that are quite widespread throughout the Islamic world. And they give all of these advice. It's all advice about how to deal with certain things, what to look out for in terms of hygiene, but also in terms of general public order, of making sure that people don't shortchange customers, that they don't mess around with the goods, but also things about water management, about how bathhouses, for instance, should get rid of their wastewater. What water carriers should do when they have a new sort of leather vessel for their water, how to get rid of the initially unpleasant taste, that sort of thing. So it's a very wide-ranging set of topics that these manuals work with, and they're meant for this muhtasib person.
And Maaike, did you have something to add to that, or Josephine covered it?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to talk a bit about HISWA manuals, but Josephine already did, so that's great. But also, I think one of the most interesting or one of the fascinating infrastructures we've been studying are the sabils, the public drinking water fountains, which you find in many cities. And they generally have a cistern underneath. So that's, again, for collecting the water, for storing the water. And they provide water to neighborhoods, to passers-by, to travelers. And there's someone working within, or a few people working within this sabil, which is a small building, which has fences on two sides. Someone handing out the water to people in the neighborhood, to people passing by. So that's, you could say a piece of infrastructure for water distribution, perhaps. It's organized through charity.
Thank you. And I think it's also drawing out one aspect that Josephine mentioned of the rainwater. I think, of course, a lot of people are aware of the great rivers of the Middle East, the Tigris and the Euphrates in Iraq, and the Nile that runs through Egypt, and including Cairo. But we don't always think about the rainwater being important. But of course, there are sudden and intense downfalls across the Middle East, not so much in Egypt, but in the Levant and Iraq. And the idea that these have to be captured when the rain comes, you really want to capture it as well. So I think that's good that you mentioned that.
And
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's also very important in Arabia. Josephine mentioned the Hajj roads in Arabia, and there they collect the water also. They collect the rainwater for the pilgrims passing by. So also there you don't think about Arabia and rainwater, but it's very important there as well.
So that brings us into, we've touched on this a little bit, but how were these different types of infrastructure managed then? What were the social and political institutions that had an impact on the way these systems, these physical systems were managed? Maaike, do you want to start with that?
So far, we found that it's managed in a very hybrid way. So you have individuals, you have elite members who invest in religious endowments, you have elite members who invest for a certain neighborhood, you have people who pay the water carriers Josephine mentions, which is a commercial way, an individual way of organizing it. And then you have the state, which is often looked upon in the sources. And I think one of the things we've discovered in the past years is that the state is organizing, so authorities are organizing water infrastructure. They are building great water infrastructure, but often they build it for themselves. They build it for their own palaces. They build it for their own estates to transport the water to their own estates. So it's a hybrid way of organization. And there's some kind of blurring of state and society. So it's not always clear whether the bigger infrastructures built by the caliphs, for example, by the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad, whether they could be used and were used underground by the inhabitants of the city. So there are multiple systems. At the same time, we shouldn't be too negative about multiple systems, but because it's also the sustainability of the system as a whole. Once you have diverse systems and one of the systems breaks down, like for example, the large infrastructures aren't maintained in times of crisis or war, then there are still the water carriers, which could be paid individually and organized individually. So it's the multiple systems, the hybrid way of dealing with it, the patchwork, so to speak, is also a way of organizing it in a sustainable manner.
That's really interesting. So it's not always, if we think of like the grand aqueducts of the Pont du Gard or in France or something, that kind of really visible, large scale infrastructure is not always the best, even if it looks very impressive.
No, yeah, that's absolutely true. And especially for drinking water, that was provided on a daily basis. So, especially drinking water and daily use of water was very often organized by water carriers.
Yeah.
And they could walk to the canals or to the river. So, the canals then were, of course, financed by the state, by state authorities, or by individuals within the state organization. But it's diverse. That's the general conclusion so far. Yeah.
And Josephine, to what extent are conceptual, cultural ways of thinking important for the way water management is dealt with? So, for example, religious ideas about water, do these play a role at all?
Yeah, they absolutely do. So one really good example of this is the role that that's already come up a bit, that charity plays in water management. So from a very early moment onwards in Islamic tradition, water is considered a very worthy cause of charity. And there's even hadiths that quote the Prophet Muhammad as saying that it's actually the best form of charity. And you actually see this very close relationship to water and charity in the terminology, because Maaike just referred to the sabils, which are these places where water is distributed on a charitable basis. And the word sabil literally means road or path. And it comes from, in this context, it comes from the phrase fi sabil Allah, so in God's path. So it indicates work that's done on God's behalf. And the connection between water and charity became so close that sabil just became shorthand for this kind of charity of the provision of water. And it's sort of, so it actually comes to refer to this physical manifestation of that, so this public drinking fountain. And you actually see that some of the founders of those water fountains actually reference again then that hadith on the sabil that they built. So they have this inscription that mentions their name and then also quotes that hadith to underline that connection there. So yes, there's a very clear correlation between religious ideas and water management.
So that gives the sense that anyone can do a charitable act to provide water. Was there anyone in society who was specifically responsible for providing water to the citizens? Maaike, governments, for example, or who was really responsible for provision of water?
Well, the interesting thing is that in the sources we see that people did look at the state authorities, at the caliph, at the governor for the provision of water. You started with this nice poem discussing Basra and Baghdad. And in Basra, there were a lot of problems with the water supply. And then one of our main sources, Al-Baladuri, a historian who wrote about it, said that it's, people looked at the caliph and they looked at the governor for clear and good water supply. But in fact, in practice, on the ground, we see that it often didn't work out that way. So the state was held responsible, but often it didn't work out the way it should have worked out. So that's something we have to deal with. Many of our sources, they tell us a normative story. They tell us how it should have been organized, and then it's for us to find out how it actually was organized. And the complaints we hear in Basra, they show us that often the caliphs weren't able to organize it in a very good way because they were too far removed, didn't have the administrators, didn't have the money, didn't have the finances to organize it themselves, or didn't want to.
So there's an ideal that rulers should have some role in providing water to cities,
Yes.
but also there's role for private charity, and people in the end have to fix their own local problems locally if they're going to die if they don't get the water.
Yeah, and often it's also a combination that well, and that's something you can find in legal text. El-Mawardi, for example, who wrote a legal text on many aspects of state administration, but also on the organization of the water supply. He's saying that the state should be responsible, but if the state doesn't have the finances, then it becomes a common responsibility. So other people should be involved. And sometimes you see this happening in practice. In Basra, for example, estates were handed out where elite members were supposed to organize the canal on their own estates after having been given the estate. So that's one way of dealing it. And we have examples from Cairo as well, where people living on the Nile, on the embankments of the Nile, had to build together or to finance together a dam that had to be built there. So it's often also seen as a combination, and this is discussed also in the legal sources. And in practice, we see the same. So this is a nice example of how practice and theory sometimes do corroborate.
And what century was Mawardi working?
El-Mawardi is 11th century, am I
11th
correct?
Century.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So we've started talking about law. Are there any other legal frameworks, Josephine? What other legal? What does the law play a role in regulating this in other ways?
To a certain extent, it does. So these are fairly normative texts. So another thing you can think about, for instance, are the tax manuals. So the kharaj of the land tax, for instance. So that has less to do with city water management, but more to do with the hinterland of these cities, which of course was also incredibly important. Because without sort of good agriculture in your hinterland, you cannot feed the city of this size. So for the state and for these major cities, this irrigation was also very important. And you see very similar things in those. So these will state that main canals and water courses, if they need to be cleared, if anything there needs to be fixed, the Treasury is primarily responsible. But it also does say, and that sort of ties in really nicely, I think, with what Maaike just described, that El-Mawardi also states, is that those immediately benefiting, and the suggestion is there, of course, that those are fairly big landholders, that they need to contribute as well. And these manuals will also say quite explicitly that this is these are the main canals and watercourses. But if there's the special canals running to individual fields, to people's orchards, to people's gardens, that is their responsibility. But things like the upkeep of riverbanks, for instance, or other infrastructure that makes sure that things don't flood, that really is for the Treasury, because that is a public interest, and that really must be entrusted to the state to make sure that things don't collapse and cause massive damage. And the extent to which the state is then able to actually carry that out, as Maaike said, that really differs per periods, but there's a general idea that's the ideal, at least.
And Maaike, you referred to the Waqf, the religious endowment, before. Can you just illuminate on that? What role does that play in providing water?
Yeah, the interesting thing is the Waqf has been there already in the early medieval period as well, but becomes much more prominent in the Ayyubid and Mamluk era, so in the second half of the Middle Ages. We see that until the 10th century, the states, the caliphs, the rulers were really possible, well, not to an ideal extent, but to generate taxes. And so they had a treasury and they could pay public services from the treasury. And that's what they did to a certain extent. After that, it becomes less common to collect the taxes or to collect enough taxes to do public works. And what we see is that after that, the Waqf becomes more prominent. Although there are examples of charities in the early Abbasid periods, there are much more in the later period. Well, charities, endowments, a Waqf is a kind of institution in which a founder decides that part of his revenues, part of his possessions will be contributed until eternity to a certain goal, certain good deeds mostly. And water provision is one of them. And building a sabil, a public drinking water fountain, is one of them. But there are other options. You can also build a madrasa, a school, a mosque, and endow some of your possessions for that purpose. But water provision is one of them. And since water provision has been seen or said, there's a hadith, a narrative on the Prophet Muhammad, who is said to have said that water provision is one of the best deeds. Building sabils, providing water to neighborhoods, is one of the main purposes of endowments. And we have these documents describing the founding of these endowments, in which is stipulated in very much detail on how it should be organized. And that's really a wonderful source for us, because it gives description on how many cups of water and how to clean the water sabil, so the fountain, how to make sure that the cistern is full during the whole year, what are the opening hours of the sabil. So many very interesting details are described in the documents that the founder stipulated at the beginning of his endowment.
So if a rich person endows a piece of agricultural land or a row of shops, for example, to provide the income in perpetuity for the sabil, for the drinking fountain, it's not just the construction of this. There's a lot of maintenance that goes, but also, I guess, workers who have to actually work to put the water in there and to make sure it's kept clean and that sort of thing. So that's what the income is going to.
Yeah, that's where the income is going to. The manager who's making sure everything is arranged, the water carriers who bring the water, for example, if we're talking about Cairo, from the Nile to the cistern. So a whole lot of community, Waqf community, that's how we call it. Yeah.
Josephine, do you have something to add to that? It looks like you have something to say.
Yeah, I do, because what Maaike said, of course, is 100% true, but I think we also mustn't forget to also hark back to what Maaike said earlier, that a lot of the major water infrastructure built by members of the elites tends to help them primarily. That is, to a certain extent, also the case, especially for these later Waqfs. So our colleague Angela Isoldi is doing work on the Waqfs in Cairo. And what you see there is that, yes, these funds are going to the people cleaning, the people providing the water, the people carrying the water from the Nile River to the cistern. But a lot of the money is also going to the person who founded it. So loads of money. So the leftover money tends to return to the person founding the foundation. So there as well, yes, there is charity going on, and yes, there is members of the elites providing water, but they're also benefiting personally, and they're benefiting both in a pious sense. They will be benefiting from their good deeds in the hereafter, but they're also benefiting in the present day in terms of money.
Yes, and in addition, it's also a way of legitimizing their power, so legitimizing their position. So we shouldn't think of charity alone.
Absolutely, and to get like a wing in a museum named after them or something.
Well, even today, I think a lot of rich people give to charity to improve their tax situation. Okay, well, I think we've covered a lot of very interesting ground, and I think we should begin to kind of conclude. I would like to ask a couple of sort of concluding, wrapping up questions to both of you. The first is it possible to make broad generalizations about these systems yet, or is it too early in the field is too young of looking at Middle Eastern water management? And I'm specifically thinking about the question of, is the way water was managed in the medieval Middle East distinctive, or are these broadly things that urban civilizations do at all places and times? Is there something that we can say is distinctive to these societies? Maybe Maaike, would you like to take that?
I think it's a difficult question, Ed. I'm thinking about it. Well, we should compare then to other civilizations, to other cities in the world, but I don't think so far there's really something specific Middle Eastern as we came across. And I'm very hesitant to do broad generalizations on either so-called Islamic or Arabic or Middle Eastern cities and whether they do it in a different way. I think what we see is comparing the cities we've studied so far, Damascus, Cairo, some of the Iraqi cities, Basra, Samarra, Baghdad. We looked a bit at Mecca, Medina, and some of the other cities. I think there are differences throughout time. One of them I already discussed just now, like early medieval and later medieval. But between the cities, there are not so many differences, actually. That's quite interesting, I would say. There are, of course, different natural circumstances, but it's always this patchwork. I think it always comes down to the patchwork, like different systems functioning next to one another, and always also a combination of commercially organized, individually organized, group organized elites and state officials. So, and I don't think it's much different in other parts of the world, I would say, in the pre-modern era, but I'm not 100% sure about that, whether we could say something is specific Middle Eastern. Would you, Josephine?
Yeah, I think that what Maaike pointed, sort of the different climatological circumstances. I mean, yeah, those obviously matter. You cannot organize water management the same way in Mecca as you can organize it in, say, Cairo or Baghdad. So I think that those sort of local circumstances tend to be much more important than a sort of overall idea of Islamic water management. I think that is much more pressing. Do we have a cultural continuum where ideas are shared? Yes, absolutely. These HISBA manuals with certain ideas about how to deal with wastewater, for instance, how to deal with hygiene, those are found from the Caspian Sea to the Iberian Peninsula, and those are in connection. Like those talk to each other, so to say.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's cultural ideas. The same applies to these charities, the specific structure of these WACFs. Yeah, you see very broad regional trends there, I think. So to a certain extent, there are things that you see across the Islamic world, but I think overall local situations are much more important. And that means sometimes that very comparable systems of irrigation, for instance, are developed. But the jury is still out. Like, is that a matter of people adapting in the same way to very similar circumstances? Or is that a matter of a technique spreading from one specific source? And that debate has not been solved.
Maybe that would be the next stage to look at and see if, for example, there's a greater role of the state in the Roman context, or whether Roman elites are the individual actors are doing a lot of work, or in China, Imperial China. But yeah, it's perhaps an unfair question at this stage of research. So what are the next steps? What is still to explore in the field? Where does research have to go next? Maaike, have you got a thought about that?
Yeah, I think what is really exciting at the moment is that people are starting to write an environmental history of the Middle East. So I think that's one of the directions. Water is one aspect of this, of course, but people dealing with natural resources, people as part of ecosystems. So it's, well, environmental history of the pre-modern Middle East is really a new, exciting field, and there's so much work to do there. But it's exciting, yeah.
And what does this do? Like, what can we draw from this in the present? What are the lessons of history? Can we draw something from how pre-modern people organized their water systems when we're thinking about crises in the world today, or is this more of a pure research for the sake of research?
I think we can learn from it, but it's always difficult. What exactly? And we've been talking within the project also with modern water managers, and we've asked them, is there something they can learn from it? And well, there are two ways to approach this. There's the tangible history or the tangible heritage. So you could go and see whether you could restore qanat systems, for example. And this has been done. And to a certain extent, they have been reused and functioning well and being more sustainable than some of the other infrastructure, which was more modern. But I think, and especially looking at what we've been studying, most can be learned from the intangible heritage, thinking about ways of organizing water, the management of water. And in that respect, I would say we might learn something about the multiple diverse systems that we see in the pre-modern Middle East. Maybe we shouldn't organize everything, we shouldn't organize water supply in the present day in a central way, but make communities, smaller communities, responsible for a certain amount of water, and then people start to use less water, perhaps. That might be one of the ways in which we can learn from the ways in which it was organized in the pre-modern Middle East.
Thank you. That's a really interesting answer. I think we've covered a lot of very interesting material. Thank you very much for giving us your thoughts on this very important area.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this.
That's all from us today. Thank you for listening.